Whetestone, I'm taking you back to 2005, my favorite cities on the planet, Jerusalem.
Absolutely.
You're doing a little commercial for your next tour to Israel. You're there with your wife, and something happened that you did not bargain for. Tell me about it.
The cameras are rolling, Faye standing next to me. I'm looking over at the old city at the eastern wall, and all of a sudden, everything vanished. The old city vanished, the earth vanished, and I'm standing, and I'm watching humanity pass before my eyes. As I'm in the presence of God, it felt like days, it felt like weeks. It was just like I was in there years. I had no idea of time, and time after time was unfolding, but it was like God was speaking to the masses and then individually to every person, hear my voice. And then I watched people that I knew. And I'm shocked because I'm watching them come out of the masses and God speaking to people I knew, ministers that I knew, hear my voice. And I watched them from childhood at times, young adulthood, growing up, doing what God said, and then I watched them going off because they heard the voice of someone else. Someone else telling how to market, how to do this, how to do that, how to present something this way, that way. And as they went off, they went on in and everything burned that God did not author. As I watched people that heard God and what they obeyed God, everything they obeyed in God went forward into glory and nothing burned. But everything that God didn't say, everything he didn't say, burned.
Now, you said that you saw people you knew,
Yes.
and you saw their great, majestic works that looked good to all of society burn. It might have started with God, but it finished with them. Did you go to some of these people? Tell me one you went to.
Well, one I went to specifically because I saw just what they were building burn. And I went to the person, I said, this is what I watched. And the person hung their head. They said, Gary, if I could change it, I would now. I said, change what? They said, change how I have finances come into the ministry. If I could change our money model, I'd change it today. I said, well, then why don't you change it?
Yeah.
I mean, why would you not do what God's saying?
I mean, I would like to toss the whole thing out if I found out it was me.
You know, sometimes I watch people build an engine and the supply line of that engine, they cannot give up because they believe the engine is the success, where the success is doing what God says. It's not what man values. It's not what man appreciates. It's not what man says is successful. The greatest shock of this, as I watched people that I knew, was when I saw myself. And I watched my life. Childhood, you know, I got born again in a mental hospital. I mean, it was a miracle God even got to me, but he did.
It's one of the most amazing testimonies I've ever heard. He was all said to have an electronic lobotomy. He would never be sane the rest of his life, and he heard God's voice. But God's had his hand on you for a long time.
He's speaking to me. I watched my voice when God spoke to me. I'm going through a divorce with my wife, and God spoke to me, Faye is your wife. I said, but God, I'm divorced from her. This is what I was experiencing. And I'm watching my life, and I saw how God restored our marriage. We got remarried again, as you know. And I'm watching when God spoke to me to go into business. But I made decisions that went off course. And I built businesses because in my mind, and I watched this, that I thought I could create enough money that I could obey God. And that wasn't God's thought.
He didn't need that. He did not need your stinking money.
He doesn't. God is not in deficit. And God spoke to me, and then I saw me in ministry. And I saw when I was listening to the voices of marketers, people knowing how to do things, people knowing how to manipulate people. And I watched how I was listening, and God stopped the vision cold. It just shut down. And he said, if you do not hear my voice and obey my voice, I will take the candle from the candlestick and I'll blow out the light. And the shock of that reality shook me to the core of my being. And I mean, I was
Gary
undone.
made major changes, and you are going to make major changes as a result of hearing the voice of God. We'll be right back. You like to be in a situation where God himself says to you, you're a pastor of a successful church, your candle's going to go out because you're doing it your way. You're not doing it my way. You have a choice. You can continue doing it your way and say, but I'm accomplishing so much. And then guess what? Not only will your candle go out, everything you've accomplished that you think is so wonderful will be burned with fire and not count for eternity. So, what changes occurred as a result of this vision?
Soon after that vision, God had spoken to me to buy a building in West Philadelphia, and he gave me the exact number to pay $365,000 for it. I sent two of the ministers that we have in our church up to find the building. I knew exactly where it was. I watched it in my spirit. They got there. I said, you're there. Just turn around. Where is the building? And they said, well, there's a building there, but it's sold. I said, that's it. Go find the owner. That's the one we're getting. Anyway, long story. It was sold for over millions of dollars. And the whole thing fell through. Finally, the owner calls back to our office and he says, I'll sell it. But I'm not going to sell it for that price. I said, but that's the price I heard from God, so that's what you're paying. Long story short, we buy the property, $365,000. It's a factory. We bought a factory in Philadelphia. Get a picture of what large that is, how large it is. So the next thing I know, what I was doing was planting churches. Because, of course, pastors open up churches.
That's your thing.
That's what you do, right?
Right.
So we have Bible colleges. We open up schools. We have schools around the world. We produce pastors and leaders. So we put a church in there. So I'm hearing now, what is God saying now? So I began to say, God,
and by the way, what he just described was before he had this vision. Now he's got this church. He's in Philly. Supernaturally, he got it. But where was your mistake?
My mistake was putting a church in there. Because God never called.
But that's what you do. You put churches in there.
That's the problem. See, people do things because they believe that's what they do, rather than hear from God to do what he's saying to do. And as a result, we do things out of a systemic sense of obligation or responsibility or activity and what other people, because we have such a large, broad amount of people coming into our location in Delaware, it would only make sense to put a church in Baltimore, one in Philadelphia, and reach out to the people that are coming.
Okay, but now you don't want your candle to go out. You don't want it to burn with fire. What do? You're already stuck. You got a church going.
I get the pastor that's at the church who's positioned. I said, look, is God talking to you today about this church? I said, forget what I have you doing. Forget what you've been doing for a couple years here. Today, is God speaking to you about this church? He said, no. I said, we're closing it. We're selling the building.
How could you do that? You got people going there. How could you stop it?
You know, Sid, if every pastor only did exactly what God said, we'd have far less out there and much more effectiveness in the kingdom of God. Far more out there. Effectiveness. As soon as we said sell it,
that, but what happened to this building?
We got $1,850,000 for it. We walked out with $1,500,000 in profit, paid off all the debts. We have no debt whatsoever in the ministry. All the burden lifted off of everything. And now we do everything without any debt or encumbrance whatsoever.
Well, you know what's even more exciting? He supernaturally teaches people how to hear God's voice. He did it in his own church. The people in his congregation hear God about the marriage. What happened with marriage?
Talking about marriage, here's a guy coming up with a fiancée. This is during the time I'm focused. We're going to hear God's voice. He says, I want to marry her. So I said, wait a minute. And I'm listening. God says, she's not to be his wife. He has a wife. I said, well, where's your wife? He goes, I don't have a wife. I said, no, where's your wife? He says, I don't know, 20 years ago, I got a divorce. I said, where is she? He goes, I don't know, I haven't talked to her. I said, before I even talk about you and get married to this woman, I said, I want you to go back and ask God who your wife is and find out what is God going to do with your life. He comes back, he says, you know, Gary, I can't believe this. He said, I couldn't even remember her name when you asked me where she was. It was like she was gone. He said, but all of a sudden, I got this love for her, and I'm thinking, okay, what happened to the girl you brought up here? You know, it's like, you know, how's this going to go? You know, what did she hear from God? You know, it's like,
I'm glad you're the pastor and not me.
She finally got the one that was looking for her, you know what I'm saying? So here's this guy hearing God. And what does he do? He finds her in California, flies out, and says, I had the most strange experience. I go up to this pastor. He said, what is God saying? And he meets her. They get remarried again together. They are now